to Sidebar, Bracewell's podcast devoted to government enforcement and investigations, corporate compliance, and white-collar criminal defense. I'm Phil Bezanson.
And I'm Matthew Nielsen.
And we are your hosts and are both partners at Bracewell LLP, where we represent companies, boards of directors, and individuals in all manners of litigation, investigations, and enforcement actions. Matthew, can you tell us who our guest is today and what we're going to be talking about?
Absolutely. Today, we're going to dip our toes into the world of U.S. export controls and sanctions. So this is a pretty interesting topic. People, I don't think, know a ton about it, but it's this interesting, complex area where there's a melding of law, national defense, and world affairs. And we have a great guest today to help us tackle this topic. Joining us is someone that we both had the pleasure to work with, Matt Bell. Matt is a senior managing director and the global lead of FTI Consulting's export controls, sanctions, and trade practice. Prior to FTI, Matt spent the majority of his career in senior legal and compliance positions in major multinational companies in the telecommunications and energy industries. In these roles, Matt focused on helping these companies build best-in-class compliance programs, often under intense government scrutiny, whether through civil or criminal investigations or government-mandated audits and monitorships. I can tell you through personal experience that Matt has been faced with overseeing compliance programs and global investigations in some of the most challenging regions in the world. Matt has grown the practice at FTI, which he started in 2019, to 24 professionals in 4 countries during the midst of a pandemic. And because of his and his team's good work, FTI's trade sanctions export control practice was named Consultancy of the Year in 2021 by World Export Control Review, which is really impressive for a practice that is not quite even 2 years old. Matt, welcome to Sidebar. We're really happy to have you.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Phil. It's good to be here. Good to speak to you both.
So let's kick it off for those listeners who they may have heard the terms export controls and sanctions. And I know there's a lot to unpack and complex, but just start off and tell us what are those and how do they differ?
Sure. So export controls really is a body of law, and it's controlled for different reasons by different agencies, and we can talk about that as we go. But big picture, it's the control of goods, software, and technology from a national and international security perspective. Basically, we don't want these goods, software, technology getting into the wrong hands. And they are based on international regimes, primarily in the U.S. There's 4 major regimes that many Western countries, and not only Western countries, other countries are members as well, but there's 4 kind of international treaties that control different parts of export controls. And so there's a multinational. I think you mentioned how world affairs intersects with this in your opening. And this is very much that piece. Export controls is primarily a multilateral control mechanism. Big distinction from sanctions, whereas sanctions are more about restricting a country or an entity or individual from accessing, in U.S. sense, U.S. capital markets, U.S. business, U.S. products and services because of a foreign policy reason or a national security reason. We don't like a certain activity, or we don't like a certain regime and how they've operated, or more frequently, we've seen it applied to human rights violations. And we want to disapprove of that behavior with more than just words, just a proclamation from Congress or an executive statement that says we don't approve of this. So we tie financial penalties or financial loss to that from a foreign policy perspective. So the key difference is like I said, export controls, goods, software, technology, don't put it in the wrong hands. And sanctions is more about financial resources, access to financial services or financial capital for your business, because the U.S. is a large market and the U.S. dollar is the primary currency. So that's the mechanism by which we implement our own unilateral foreign policy decisions. Now, it is possible to have multilateral sanctions. We see that on North Korea, right? That's a UN Security Council resolution. Most of those sanctions are at the UN level. But then you see programs like Cuba, which is U.S. only. Nobody else is sanctioning Cuba. You see a divergence now on Iran between the U.S. and the EU. So they can be multilateral, but they tend to be more unilateral on the sanctions side.
So you mentioned that sanctions, can be sort of specific, nation driven. And like you say, in the case of Cuba, the United States is really the only nation that's imposing sanctions on Cuba. But with the multilateral component of export controls, does that mean that the export control regime that, say, companies located in the US have to focus on is essentially a common body of law that exists around the world and is essentially interchangeable, whether you're a company shipping stuff to and from the US or a company that's in some other country that's a party to this multilateral agreement, shipping to the US or shipping elsewhere? And if that's the case, is it then sort of true to say that these export controls are a fairly static set of rules because it's hard to get lots of countries to agree to make changes to anything?
Well, with the last part of it, absolutely. It is difficult to get 40 plus countries. Wassenaar is the main arrangement. And I think it, is over 40, maybe 43 countries are now members. Getting them all to agree when one of those members is Russia and then everybody else. I mean, Russia can object to a lot of things, and it is things are added to the list by consensus. You have to get kind of everyone on board generally to add things. So it is a very slow process on a multilateral. The U.S. has figured out how to deal with that, which is there's a lot of unilateral controls as well that they've started implementing more and more into the export control side. I would say that was less frequent in the past, but more and more they're implementing things on their own. And there's a lot of talk in the news today about plurilateral approach to export controls. And so a very simple example is it's a complex industry, but semiconductors. We're all seeing the news about shortage of chips for automobiles and other things. Well, if what you're trying to control is, let's say China, for instance, you have a concern that they are going to advance in the semiconductor industry, and that's harmful to national security from whatever country's perspective. Well, there's some certain choke point technologies, like maybe it's semiconductor manufacturing equipment, the actual things you need to make the chips. Well, that pretty much only resides within a handful of countries, right? The Netherlands is a key one. The U.S. pressured the Dutch not to sell certain cutting edge technology to China last year. Recently, it was in the news, right? You've got kind of Japan and Korea have parts of that. There's parts of Europe that have it. Germans have certain technology. The Dutch have technology. The U.S. has a piece of that. So you may not need all 47, 43 countries, whatever it is, to agree, because now you're taking more of a plurilateral approach saying, let's find the countries that actually own this technology, that if we control it at these 5 or 6 countries, it doesn't matter what the rest of the world is doing because they don't have it. And so there is a move from multilateral, I think, towards plurilateral on key technologies. But the U.S. also does unilateral things. They will control things that no one else cares about. They will control the parties that no one else cares about. So they have a lot of their own lists and a lot of their own controls as well.
So maybe to take a quick step back, we're talking about 40 plus countries that have agreed to the set of rules. I'm just kind of curious why. Like what's the value gained from having this international consensus about controls on certain types of products or technology or data?
Well, and so it's interesting. If you look at the history of each of the international regimes, they kind of have a different reason for why they came to be, right? So Wassenaar is really about dual use technology and also military technology. There's, kind of the dual use list and the military list. And it's about countries that have some common interest at some point in the past came together and they said, we want to control these items because they can use strategically against us. And it did start as more of an alliance of allies. And over the years, countries can be added to the list. And so the original group is not the group we have now. There's been several countries added that maybe in retrospect, they might think shouldn't have been added or wouldn't align with their interest at this point, right? But if you look at like the Australia group related to certain things, there's a chemical and biological weapons convention. The missile technology control regime is very specific to obviously missile technology, right? the Australia group, is coming out of a time when there were, chemical weapons and other things used, biological weapons that you didn't want to be used in the Iran-Iraq war. And so you look at the impetus for each of these multilateral regimes, and there was a basis for it of where countries said, hey, we all agree that this stuff shouldn't be in the wrong hands. And so the benefit is if we all control it and we all limit access to it, then it will be harder for those bad actors or the perceived bad actors at the time to gain access to those things and use them in a nefarious way. So that was the idea, was that if we all control it, the bad guys can't get it.
So Matt, let's kind of break this down and let's use kind of examples of how this actually works for companies on a day-to-day basis, right? Let's kind of start with, I think, maybe the easier one to understand, and that's sanctions. So, essentially sanctions prohibits you from doing business in certain areas or with certain people. But talk a little bit about how does this affect a company? How does it impact them? And who oversees it? And just how that mechanically works at a very high level.
Okay. And just to, as we're clarifying, sanctions, when I'm using it in kind of this conversation, is really focused on the traditional meaning of that word, which is kind of these financial and trade sanctions. Those are primarily overseen in the U.S. by OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which is within the Treasury Department. They're really just affecting State Department policy. So State Department makes foreign policy. Other agencies obviously feed into that. Defense and commerce and other intelligence apparatus feed into those decisions. But they're affecting foreign policy through sanctions. And that's what we're talking about. So how does that work for a company in the real world? Let's use we'll make up a manufacturer. They actually sell a physical product, a widget that they're gonna send across borders. Well, when they look at sanctions, the way it's going to affect them is they're probably going to need a policy and a procedure about where they do business, who they do business with. They're going to need a way to confirm they're not doing business with a country that's on a sanctions list or an individual or company. So most companies will have some type of software mechanism that screens the destination in their logistics system to say, where are we shipping this widget to? They may have customers, suppliers, vendors that they're screening through a software to say, hey, is Matthew Nielsen on this list of people that we can't do business with? Or is there somebody with a similar name? Maybe it's Matt Nielsen with an O-N on the end. Well, that's close enough. We should check and see if that's really who we think it is. And so day to day, that's how it's affecting them. Is they're going to have policies, procedures. They're going to need probably a software to screen both the destinations from a logistics perspective, also the parties they're doing business with. And then a bigger impact can be banking relationships. Banks are de-risking significantly in the space of sanctions. And even if you expand that out to other things, export control risk, reputational risk, right? Those that are in the news for human rights violations, other things that aren't officially on a list yet, you'll find that if you start engaging those parties, even when legal, you may not be able to get a bank to do the transaction, right? And that's been a big issue for European companies recently with the different views on Iranian sanctions between the U.S. and the European Union after the U.S. pulled out of the JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal, as it's commonly called. They were legally able to still try to do that business, but they couldn't find a bank to transact the financial piece of it. So you still had effective sanctions on Iran because of the lack of the banking sector engagement. So that's a real practical impact companies see with sanctions is in their banking relationships as well.
Well, let's pivot to maybe the more difficult topic for those who haven't actually seen it face to face. And, let's maybe focus on an energy, hypothetical energy company. And you and I have had conversations about this, and you have an interesting perspective on how you approach these and explain it to people. But how would export controls affect, a company that's saying, listen, I don't sell anything to North Korea or Iran or any bad guys. So what do I need to worry about?
Yeah, I think you're right. Most people immediately go to the headline news countries like you just mentioned. Well, we don't sell to these players, or we don't anymore. Maybe we had an issue in the past, but we don't make anything that's that exciting, right? We don't make any technology that's cutting edge or that can be used nefariously or we don't make military products. We're not a defense contractor. And so one of my previous roles, like it was really changing that perception was key. And so I'd go into the trainings and I would just tell people, hey, we work here at this energy company, this oil field company. And I know most of you think we just work with dumb iron, as they call it in the oil field, and we stick it down a hole and we get oil and gas out. And there's no big deal about that. But how many of you think that we make or we sell items that are used in chemical weapons? And, nobody raises their hand in the room. They're all staring at you like, what are you talking about? And then you start going through some of the chemicals that are used, whether it's in the hydraulic fracturing process or in other, processes that the company does that are precursors to sarin gas or mustard gas or other things. And they don't realize it. And you say, yeah, it's on this list from back to the international regimes. The Chemical Weapons Convention has a whole list of chemicals that are restricted for these reasons. We're using it for a very maybe benign purpose in the oil field sector, but if you take that and mix it with some other things in the right process, you get a very bad chemical weapon. And so that's why it's controlled. Okay, well, that makes sense. Like we got that one chemical, but we don't have anything else, right? And then you say, okay, well, how many of you think we have encryption in the oil field? Well, maybe some people raise their hand, but it's like a lot of the reporting tools and there's all this proprietary technology on finding oil under the ground, right? You don't want your enemy or your competitor to know how you find the oil because then they'll copy it. So there's high levels of encryption on all of this software in this space for proprietary reasons, but highly encrypted items are controlled for export under the Wassenaar arrangement. And then it always blows their mind with this one was back at that time, if you had an oil field inspection tool, it needed to be really accurate. And so I'd ask the question, do you think we have missile technology in this company? Do we make missiles? Well, no, we don't make missiles, right? We're an oil field company. But if you're inspecting a pipeline for a crack or a weakening or something, a leak, and it's underground, and you're going to dig a hole to fix it, you can't be off by 5 or 10 feet. You need to be extremely accurate. And the only technology at that time that was available was military-grade missile technology in an inertial measurement unit. The same thing they put in the missiles. The Northrop Grumman made for missiles, they're now putting in a PIG, pipeline inspection tool in the oil field. And that's controlled under what's called the ITAR, the International Traffic in Arms Regulations. It's about military goods and technology and weapons. And nobody would expect that that's in the oil field. So once you kind of walk them through how they can have connection to these things and open their eyes to it, then they start to kind of come around to like, okay, this is something we have to take seriously and deal with because we don't want to be in the headlines for just selling our extra IMUs at a garage sale here in town, and it goes to some bad guy who's then using it against our troops or other reasons around the world.
Well, it's not just necessarily selling things abroad and knowing who your customer might be abroad. I mean, obviously many energy companies, oil field services companies operate in countries all over the world. So is this something that they should be thinking about in situations as simple as we're going to set up operations someplace new and we have to take all of this equipment that we use in the US and bring all this equipment someplace else and set it up? Is there a process for making sure that's done correctly or vetted correctly?
Absolutely. And it's not always to the extent of, okay, I'm taking a controlled technology that has these broader implications. It's you're moving commercial items across borders. That requires import and export clearance procedures, whether or not the item is on an export control list. There might be additional procedures for licensing if it's on a control list, but I can remember stories of people just hand carrying commercial items, not following the internal process. And they got picked up on the other side of that flight and arrested and put in jail in Central America. And we had to go meet with the prime contractor, explain the situation, help use their influence to explain the situation and pay the fines and penalties to get people out of jail just because they weren't following procedure on import and export, let alone if something's actually on a control list. So absolutely, that is a requirement. And if I can go back to sanctions for a moment while we're doing the oil field example, you also have to look at all of the ownership of who you're dealing with, not just who hired you to do the service in this example, but who owns the rig, who owns the rights to that field. And it can be something in the sanctions rules. I remember at my prior company, Coupet, which is the Cuban national oil company, had a 5% interest in an offshore development. And under the rules, that prohibited U.S. companies from doing the services on that project, that very small minority interest. When we had the Russian sanctions come out after the invasion of Crimea, everyone was trying to figure out what to do because they changed how they controlled oil-filled goods from being this 5-digit export control classification number to using what's normally used for import, what's called a harmonized tariff schedule number, an HS number. And suddenly you're trying to figure out this dumb iron, this actual piece of pipe is now on a list that says, I can't send it to an Arctic project in Russia, or I can't send it, deep water offshore, and deep water was not defined the same way by the European Union and the US because meters and feet aren't equal, as we all have probably learned in school, right? What does production in shale mean? And so that was a mixture of kind of sanctions and export controls coming together that was very practical. Like I literally remember doing a flow chart, staying up almost all night doing these flow charts for the people on the ground in Russia at our company to say, which piece of pipe can I stick down which hole in the ground? Did it arrive before this certain date in August? Then it's grandfathered in and I can use it. Was it on the water? Was it not shipped yet? There were different sets of rules for those scenarios as to it's the same piece of pipe, same chemical makeup, same length, same fittings, but depending on when it was on the ground in Russia, told me whether or not I could use it in that Arctic project. And so it can become very nuanced and detailed in that sense as to practically how do you do your day job and how do you do it without breaking the rules.
So Matt, let's talk a little bit about things that you're seeing, kind of trends. Obviously, whenever there's a change in administration, there's usually, especially when it comes to a change in the party that is in power, there tends to be a change in enforcement priorities. But talk a little bit about what you're seeing. Talk about what you expect will be coming out of the Biden administration on these issues.
Well, I will say this area of export controls and sanctions and where it was trending under Trump and where it has gone with Biden, they are fairly aligned. This is one area where there wasn't a massive change with the administration. There is still a high, intense focus of kind of all the agencies on the China relationship and what level of technology and products we want China to have, what level of business engagement do we want U.S. business to have. It's just maybe a different nuance in how they've used the tools at their disposal. Trump was very focused on tariffs, right? And actually making somebody pay more money to bring those products, into the country and pay a financial penalty in that way. Whereas, Biden has been more about trying to develop, plurilateral, multilateral agreement on what is happening with China and how we're going to approach it. They have actually done more banning of imports based on perceived forced labor issues with those products. So it's not, you can bring it in, but you got to pay. It's more, you just can't bring it into the country, period. And there are hundreds of millions of dollars of products stacking up at our ports that are not being allowed entry because of forced labor under what's called a withhold release order. So he's using more of a customs procedure to block those things. You do see sanctions occurring under both, right? More individuals are being added to what's called the SDN list, which is an OFAC Treasury sanctions list. What is the impact of that? It depends on who they are. Like sometimes it's just a political statement. So when you saw, what was happening with the Hong Kong protests and the national security law, a number of Hong Kong leaders were put on the list, and some mainland Chinese leaders were put on the list to just voice disapproval of what they're doing. And it limited their access to maybe the U.S. financial system. But what's interesting is on the other side of that equation, they were rewarded in China and viewed as kind of heroes to the other side of that equation for being sanctioned by the U.S. And the inverse happens here. If you remember, I think Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio were both put on a China sanctions list. No one really knows what that means in China because it's not well defined. But they both, I think, tweeted and maybe even held press conferences saying, look how good of a job I'm doing. The Chinese have put me on a list, right? So in some ways, it's symbolic and it doesn't have an impact. But if you look at other areas where the sanctions are increasing related to the human rights or other facts, it does have a significant impact. They are putting major companies on either the SDN list or on the Commerce Department side, which is traditionally export controls focused. Maybe they're putting them on the entity list, which in reality is only a requirement to get an export license to do that business. But there is a policy of denial, and most people effectively treat it as a prohibition on business. They don't want to figure out the nuance. So it's kind of like whichever restricted list in the news, you'll hear them called a blacklist, right? The headline will always be U.S. government blacklists this company or that company. And you really have to look at the details if you're a nerd like me to figure out what that actually means. But for a lot of companies and a lot of banks, you're on a list. We're done. Like, we're not doing business with you anymore.
So in addition to having commercial relationships get strained or suspended or eliminated, I know you mentioned the prospects of winding up in a South American jail and needing an employer to come and bail you out and smooth things over. But what are the real additional sort of punitive risks that organizations can face for either innocently or sort of sloppily messing up on some of these complex issues, or maybe being less than sloppy, but more deliberate in trying to evade or work around some of these requirements?
Yeah, so there are absolutely civil and criminal penalties under the law. So you can pay fines, you can have criminal settlements, and there is a priority to find individuals who are bad actors and put them in jail if possible, and to actually have individual accountability, because they know they've seen from a corporate perspective, some corporations view fines as a cost of doing business, and it doesn't have, the deterrent effect they would like for it to have. So there is a priority on individual prosecutions as well. But there's also just the reputational risk. If you're a publicly traded company, these fines and penalties are generally going to rise to a materiality threshold. And so you're going to have to report in your public filings that, hey, we're going through this investigation. We have a disclosure in. You're waiting for the kind of shoe to drop with the actual number. So there's an impact to your market valuation and your ability to get capital to grow your business. I think more and more, there's also just the supply chain and systemic risk of, if you are viewed as a risky partner, your customers may not want to work with you. And we see this in kind of the evolution of the ESG culture or ethical investing, ethical buying. You might lose customers. You also might lose suppliers. I think more and more we're seeing suppliers want to have stability in their business. And so they look at you and say, what, you're about to get on a list, or you're about to be, in some hot water. I'm not sure I want to be connected to you. I need to de-risk. And so, that's happening with large telecom companies right now in China that we see in the news, in the semiconductor space. But if I look at my U.S. client base, they may have significant business with some of these companies, but they're trying to figure out how to de-risk, because they don't see this changing anytime soon. They don't see the U.S. and China magically coming together and having that kumbaya moment anytime in the near future. And so they're figuring out, we need to shift our client customer base. We need to start not having 20, 30% of our revenue go to this one large company, because if they actually get put on the SDN list, or we can't get those licenses from the Commerce Department, we have a much bigger problem with our shareholders and with the market. So there's real practical impacts to not doing this the right way, to your shareholders, to your customers, and also to the employees. I would always say, I never like to scare the employees with, you're going to go to jail. You're going to be the one we put handcuffs on. I don't think that's real effective. It doesn't happen very frequently to kind of the individual line workers. It's usually an executive who made some high level decision, if anybody. But what I do say is, we all want to make this company more money. We want to make it more stable. We want job security. And the number one way we do that is to make sure the company is not in the headlines for the wrong reasons, that it's in the headlines for the right reasons, for doing the right thing, for being an ethical company. And we had several studies we would show that you're actually more valuable as a company when you're ethical. You have a higher market capitalization. All of these studies have been done to show doing things the right way actually pays off from a business perspective, regardless of just a corporate social responsibility imperative.
Well, this is one of the areas, because it's so heavily regulated, it's so dense as far as rules and regulations and administrative oversight, kind of thinking through, kind of taking the outliers away. This is an area in which, and like for you to talk a little bit more about this, you can kind of take your own fate in your hands here And we talk about it in the white collar world, cooperating with the government, self-disclosing with the government. But in these regimes, and you expand on this, there are actually rules that talk about kind of how that is supposed to benefit you instead of policies.
Yeah, there are benefits with a number of these agencies to self-disclosure and kind of mandated mitigation of your penalties. There are rules about when you have to disclose. For example, if you sell military technology to China and other countries on what's called the 126.1 list, once you discover that, you are mandated to disclose. It's not an option. You have to do it, and you have to do it as soon as reasonably possible. It says immediately, I think, in the regulations. But you can still get some benefit from disclosing. You still have these mitigations. I tell a lot of our clients, be proactive, right? You don't want the first time you have a conversation with your regulator to be when you're bringing them a problem, right? Whether that is let's talk about it from a Commerce Department, Bureau of Industry and Security, the main kind of export control agency in the U.S. that most companies who probably listen to this are going to be dealing with. They have people in the field called Office of Export Enforcement. They have agents all over the country. They also have export control officers stationed around the world, overseas in a number of locations. They do outreach visits, and they want to get to know you and know your company. They want you to let them know what you're doing to build your compliance program and how you're evolving that. And I know from experience, and I have a lot of friends who are in those roles or have come from those roles. Some of them now work with me at FTI. The companies who did that proactive outreach and then had an issue, it was a very different demeanor in that conversation. It was, hey, here's all the things we've done. We had a mistake. Here's our disclosure. And, most of them get closed out without any fines or penalties. It's over 95%, I think, last time they published statistics. And that's for everyone. But I bet if you look at those who are proactive, few, if any, that I've ever heard of who were proactive ever got a penalty, right? They were just building that relationship. So everyone knew this wasn't intentional. We're trying to do the right thing. These are complex rules, and the government knows they're complex. And I think if you can show, they always say risk-based approach. I think this is common across a lot of compliance areas, whether that's, FCPA compliance, money laundering, data privacy, cybersecurity, or export and sanctions. What you'll hear from government is you need a risk-based program. But I think a lot of companies haven't actually properly assessed their risk and then clearly articulated how they're addressing it. So my recommendation to companies is build what I call a risk and control matrix. And it's not going to be one-to-one. Like if the risk is selling to sanctioned countries, your controls might be system controls that don't allow you to choose that country from a drop-down menu when they're ordering from your website. You may have terms and conditions that say you're not allowed to do this. Then you may have screening to prevent it. Then you may have a warranty and repair service that checks for the location. Or if it's a technology item, where does the IP address ping from when it looks for a software update? All of those are controls to prevent that one risk. And then you can also create an audit matrix against that. But I know the government loves to see those when you can present them in a clear way to say, here's all the risk we've identified, and here's the multiple ways we're controlling against that risk. And if you see something missing, please let us know. But if you've already had that conversation because you presented your program to them and something does slip through, in some ways it's like, well, not that you're blaming it on the government, but hey, here's an area for improvement. You didn't see it. We didn't see it. Now we know to fix it. And so I think that's one thing most companies have assumed what their risks are instead of sitting down and really going through a diligent process to say, let's write them out. What are all the risks and what are all the ways we're going to control for those risks?
And it sounds like this is something that could be an exercise that could be undertaken by, an organization of any size or an organization with no program or one with a highly sophisticated, mature program, just because all you need to do is read the news to see that risks change because sanctioned country issues change, tariff issues change, the news changes, right?
Well, and your company changes, right? One of the issues we see is somebody's with a company for a long time that has a very low risk profile. And then an acquisition happens that fundamentally changes that risk profile and nobody catches it. We had a client recently who was historically known for making tools that you would buy at Lowe's or Home Depot. And then they bought a defense contract, right? Fundamental change. Now they need to be ITAR registered. They need a lot of different controls on technology and technical data. You can't just let everyone in the company have access to a database because they may be not a U.S. person or a foreign national, and that creates issues. Or another client we were talking to recently, they historically made toys and board games. That's cool. That's not real. Just so you know, that's not high risk, even if it's the game risk. It's a whole different thing. But they start expanding into media and entertainment. Well, suddenly, maybe there's financial flows you never thought of. I know in one of my past lives, had an employer that had a chartered bank within it that nobody mentioned to me when I started. I found it kind of by accident. I'm like, wait a minute, that's a control program for a bank is fundamentally different than a widget maker manufacturer. And so sometimes that's what's changing is your own company risk is changing without you even being aware of it because they didn't bring the compliance person into that conversation. You need to be part of the M&A team, the diligence team. But you're right, Phil. Any level of company can do this. The difference, some of your risk will be different, but the controls should also be different. One of my pet peeves when I was in-house was consultants coming to me, or lawyers, I'll throw you guys in the mix too, coming to me and telling me that I needed to do certain things to remediate a risk that were best in class, gold standard, industry leading, whatever terminology you want to use. And I would ask the question, tell me 3 companies similarly sized to us who have actually done those things. And you get blank stares because nobody else is actually doing some of these things. It's just a good idea maybe that somebody came up with. It's not practical. It can't be implemented. And it's not the right size for my company. So if you're a very small company, talking about screening for the guys on the list, there's a government website that has a pretty good tool with fuzzy logic where you can type in a name just like you would in Google, but it's on the government consolidated screening tool, and see if they're on any of the U.S. sanctions list. Now, that's not scalable because there's no upload feature. It's one at a time. But if you only have 10 customers a month, totally good way for you to do that. You just need to document it, PDF it, do something to have a record. But if you have 100 million customers, I was just dealing with a client the other day who told me they have 100 million records that need to be screened. Well, guess what? The government website is not going to be the tool for them. And most software that is out there for corporations, and this is a widget maker company, it's not going to be right for them. They need what the banks use. For that volume, they need the tools the financial services companies are using for that volume of transactions and that sophistication of algorithm. And you need probably AI and machine learning to continually get better at reducing false positives. Just your sheer volume would be unsustainable. And so that's kind of how I talk to companies is the process is similar, and regardless of size, your risk will be different and your controls should absolutely scale to your company's size, need, and sophistication. And the government agrees with that. Like that's something I've talked to them about, and they understand it really has to be right-sized. It's not one size fits all. Well,
and the government's been maybe refreshingly out there about talking about what they expect from compliance programs. Of course, there's the DOJ guidance that was updated last year. And one of the things that they do preach is it's not one size fits all, but they also preach, you can't just set it and forget it, right? To use the TV commercial. This is something you've got to reevaluate these risks, see what controls, see if they're working, implement lessons learned. And they're saying it so often and repeatedly that, like you said, it's going to be a whole lot better coming to the government, showing that, look, here is the risk assessment that we recently did. Here are the changes we did in connection with that. Maybe we missed something. Maybe we didn't get it 100% right. But that company's going to be in a whole lot better situation than the company that never did it or did it 5-10 years ago, right?
Well, and if you have documented reasons for why you do things, right? And I used to always kind of joke that on the export control side, there's all this outreach about know your customer, do your diligence. And I always said they kind of have a Google test. If their enforcement agent can go and Google that counterparty and within a few minutes find information that is a big red flag that might tell you that they had a defense business or operations in Iran or whatever it is, you probably should have caught that. But from a scale perspective, I've also had that conversation with the government to say, do you think that's true? And they will say, well, yeah, I mean, if it's that easy to find, I was like, okay, now let's say that took 10 minutes, but I have 100 100,000 or 100 million customers. Do you expect me to do that on every one of them? Well, no. Okay, so let's talk about that. So when they say those things about, we understand it's different for each company, you can kind of call them out on that when they make an unreasonable recommendation, but you have to have data. You have to have numbers and metrics to say, here's the reason why we did this the way we did it. Here was our risk assessment. Here was our control. Yes, this slipped through, but sometimes I've gone to them and said, we're not going to change anything because we think it's an anomaly, right? It's just, if this happens, we can't design a program to prevent that without crippling the entire company. So there may be alternative controls to mitigate it some, but it can't be that we're just going to Google search everyone. And having worked, a bit in my career in China, I also point out, well, just Google it. Well, there's no Google in China. It doesn't work when you cross the border. And Baidu is not a good search engine. It doesn't return good results. And so it's not as simple as they may think it is sometimes, the way they've done their investigation. And you're honed in on something solely for that one investigation. That's a lot different than we are day to day with lots of customers.
Well, unlike many of our other conversations that our listeners have hopefully enjoyed, it seems like in this set of circumstances, there is a good deal of logic and measure and some things that market participants can feel fairly hopeful about, that, if they can take fate in their own hands and do some groundwork and be diligent and thorough up front, that they may be able to make it through any sort of difficult patches in pretty good shape, if not completely unscathed. So, Matt, we really appreciate hearing all of this stuff from you today. Thank you for joining us. Listeners, as always, thank you for downloading. You can obviously get this episode of Sidebar at bracewell.com and anywhere else where you find your podcasts. Thanks very much.
Thank you.